I'm just coming in here before my video to say a lot of the topics I'm discussing in this one are very pertinent and a little bit heavy. So if you're not in the right headspace to be watching a very honest kind of analysis on our generation's fears, do not watch this video. Okay, that's it. Hope you enjoy. Just if you're not in the right headspace, I'll see you in the next one. Has something ever made you feel afraid that isn't really scary? Why do some things make us feel deep fear and dread that don't really have any horror elements to them? Why is this scene of this woman from Pulse moving in this way making us feel scared? Why do liminal spaces give us a feeling of dread? It uses something far more primal and far darker. I'll literally never forget when I got out of the theater after seeing Skinamarink. I had to take the bus because my car was broken down at the time, and I was in this like little theater with a bunch of people at the VIF, and the feeling of walking out of that theater and then the bus full of people back was this feeling of dread. I literally felt like a deep childhood fear and dread that I had not felt in such a long time. And the movie isn't even really scary. Like, it doesn't utilize any classic horror elements. It literally just utilizes liminal horror. Now, when you think of the idea of liminal horror, you don't really have to search very far to see that it's been around for a very long time and it's not really a new idea whatsoever. David Lynch, for example, mastered this type of horror. When you watch his movies, okay, another person talking about David Lynch movies on a video essay on YouTube, how revolutionary is that? But when you watch his films, there is this grating fear and dread that is so horrifying because you don't realize how under your skin it has dug until you have finished the movie and you're going about your daily life. The weirdo scenes that he puts in his films are extremely affecting because they burrow underneath you. And there's this book, A Short Stay in Hell, that was written in 2009 that is literally just about some dude in an endless labyrinth of corridors, stairwells, and bookshelves. And the books sometimes have nonsensical things in them. It's quite literally backrooms horror, but in 2009. So liminal horror is not new. It's been around the block. So let me define some concepts, because when I say liminal horror, I think that's an overused term and what the fuck am I talking about? Inherently, liminal horror dread comes from the idea that the state that you're in will never end or never make sense. It comes from the Latin word limen, that means threshold. And in anthropology, it means a transitional state. So the stage where a person is no longer their old or new self, and they're in that uncomfortable middle period. And if you kind of look at things from a Buddhist radical acceptance mindset, a lot of suffering comes from the idea that we don't see things as temporary and transitional because everything has an end, and that can release a lot of your suffering to know that things have an end. But in a liminal horror universe, there is no end. A liminal space is one of transit, waiting, emptiness, endlessness. It is deeply unsettling because it strips away the context of what we think that we know about the universe. It comes from the feeling that we are in an environment or a universe that makes no sense and we will be trapped here forever. That is where the dread comes, because it's not the fear of getting tortured or dying. And that's kind of traditional horror, is you're scared that you're gonna die from the slasher. This is different. This is very primal and it is very, very affecting. Liminal horror is empty parking garages, stairwells, waiting rooms, highway rest stops, and those areas stretching into infinity. So areas where you're not supposed to be for a very long time, just stretching. And there usually isn't a hostile enemy, which is interesting. The environment itself is the enemy. So when you are trapped in a liminal space, the threat is not of death, but of insanity, because your brain would immediately begin to panic and it destroys your mind. A lot of liminal spaces also do this thing where they introduce impossible geometry. This is also called non-Euclidean geometry, which I literally just learned about, so I'm not that smart. But it's essentially this guy, Euclid, came up with a bunch of ideas on how the physical world works and how we can expect the physical world to work, like how parallel lines never cross. It's basically things you would take for granted and kind of inherently know. But here's an example of how unsettling it is when something is not following the Euclidean geometry that we do know. This is just like a Minecraft house, but you can see how disorienting that is. The backrooms are the perfect example of a liminal space because the backrooms aren't just these creepy transitional spaces, they are also utilizing a lot of subsets of this genre of horror, like time being wrong, which traps the character in a state of purgatory. And what's interesting about time being wrong is it presents an idea that is much worse than like your classic being tortured or dying, because the time loop is a threat existentially. There's this scene in the Endless where this guy is in a time loop and he's stuck getting killed like in a loop, and it is so horrifying. It's so much worse than anything, like it's existential dread. And in the time loop, death is not an end, which we understand intuitively as an end. So if being in a liminal space makes you feel insane because it will never end, or it feels like it will never end, the time loop makes you feel insane because of the same thing, but also it isolates you very much from the rest of the world. Another theme of liminal horror is also isolation, because not only are you trapped in an area where there is nobody else or very few people, but time not being right, like the time loop, creates insane levels of panic and isolation because you are the only one accumulating memories and you are essentially in your own universe. It also evokes dread of like this Sisyphean idea that this labor has no end and like you're doing pointless repeating tasks forever. Now, on top of like liminal spaces and physics and time not being correct, liminal horror also utilizes a very subtle type of horror called the uncanny valley. Now, the uncanny is also overused, but it's essentially the familiar feeling corrupted in the context of liminal horror. It's this concept of the uncanny is like goes back to 1919, and like Freud wrote an essay about the eeriness of dolls and like wax people. But for Freud, the uncanny is located in the strangeness of the ordinary. So vampires and zombies and shit are way too strange to be uncanny. The uncanny relies on a very subtle deviation of what you see every day, and that is so much more horrifying than like something overtly wrong with someone, or something that's obviously like a creature or something. Now, there's a few different ways to show the uncanny. Like, you have the someone isn't quite right type of uncanny, where it's like kind of impossible proportions, and that idea shows up everywhere from like gigantic films to the Mandela catalog, which is literally here on YouTube. There's also the doppelganger, like imposter horror, which is the fear that a loved one has been replicated or duplicated and is basically a threat, not because they're trying to attack you, but because something doesn't feel right. There's also this like loss of autonomy type of uncanny valley where someone is being puppeted by something else, and that one can get a little bit more overt horror, but it still kind of falls in that uncanny valley. Like, this video is obviously like it's a CGI horror video, but it really does feel like uncanny because something is not right, but it seems familiar enough to fall into that category where you're like, what the fuck's going on? And my personal favorite is just the classic uncanny valley, which is this hypothesis, and this is like scientifically proven, that when things fall in between human and not human in a really specific type of familiarity, it evokes dread in somebody, and it just elicits like uncanny and eerie feelings in you. And this is when creators of a media will try and use this uncanny valley, but I've noticed it's actually way harder than you think to do that, because I feel like a lot of people do it and fail. But areas where it works is scenes like this from It Follows, where that person is not right. Like something is going on there, but it's familiar enough to fall into this liminal category of horror. It's subtle, it's not overt. Now we've talked about the liminal spaces, the time distortions, and the physical characteristics of like humanoid creatures. There's also a fourth subset of this like subtle horror that is the someplace isn't right kind of trope. And this is the subversion of a safe place. So you think the home or a playground or even like a pool. Like they use like this really specific early 2000s pool that we've all been in when we were kids, and it kind of is pretty affecting. And there are typically very small differences. Namely, you are trapped there, but also there are no people. And the environment feels hostile. But it hasn't changed into like blood dripping from the walls or something under the bed. It is just weird. An extension of this is the Stepford effect, which is feeling too polished and too nice to the point that it's unsettling. Like you're in a community that's too polite, you're in a place that's too clean, and that can be very, very, very scary. The Stepford Wives is one of my favorite horror movies. I don't know why I never talk about it, but the original Stepford Wives is awesome for this. Part of the horror of like the place isn't right trope is the dread that you don't have anywhere else to go, because it's usually your home or somewhere that you understand is like a home. The home is supposed to be the ultimate defense against the outside world. And when home feels fundamentally wrong, there is nowhere left to go. Okay, now that I've defined what my idea of like liminal uncanny horror is, I want to talk about why this type of horror will define the next generation of horror enjoyers. If media continues to reflect the struggles of what people are going through, I think it will go this way. And it's funny because when I usually talk about like horror and culture, I'm like talking about things that have already happened, and I'm just like discussing things that I'm noticing. But I'm trying to make a prediction based on what I know to be true. Liminal horror literally defines all of the existential dread of the upcoming generations, and it speaks to all of the horrors that we're experiencing. And what is so exciting about horror movies is they are quite literally a mirror reflection for what that culture is afraid of at the time. And you have to ask the question, what are we afraid of? What scares a generation of people that do not take anything seriously whatsoever? And what's interesting about people around my age and younger is we grew up with kind of satirized versions of classic horror tropes just happening constantly. And how are we supposed to be afraid of things that we literally grew up with being sanitized and satirized for us? And how do you scare someone who literally doesn't care about anything? And the answer to that is existential threats that are beyond explanation, threats that are metaphysical or touching on very primal parts of your brain. And the horror of liminal spaces is that they are a facade for something much darker that you don't really understand. And for the younger generations, we have been lied to in a major way. Liminal horror presents to you this idea that you're not seeing what you're being shown, and you feel uneasy even though nothing is overtly wrong. And what does that define? The youngest half of the generations. Like, that is exactly how we feel all the time. Young people have experienced such a profound loss of so many things, starting with third spaces and a complete upheaval of what we grew up with. Not only do we not have third spaces, but like the spaces that are like low barrier to entry, like grocery stores and malls, are becoming an actual nightmare. And beyond like the dynamic pricing and underpaid of it all, rampant commercialization has literally created the death of the mall, and urban design prioritizing cars and luxury condos has created a real life liminal horror in a lot of areas. It has decimated any feeling of coziness that we grew up with as kids, or like the hominess that a neighborhood store would have felt like 30 years ago. Even the big chains. There is like a modernization of the third space that is quite unsettling and not welcoming. Severance was a gigantic success, and I think that is heavily in part due to hitting the razor thin edge between liminal horror and overt horror, because it uses like very subtle things to unsettle and scare you. Like in theory, endless, windowless, sterile hallways really shouldn't scare you, but like primally, we know that that's not natural and it does unsettle us. I don't know about you, but I would hate to be working there and have half my brain cut off. That's actually crazy. It also touches on the idea that we are very afraid as a generation of repeating labor and the complete loss of our autonomy by corporations. So like, gone are the days of your work or your grocery store or your third space feeling like an extension of your home. And quite literally, liminal space horror is about not feeling at home. It's about, where am I going to go? It is the absence of a grounding space. Like, for example, Skinamarink is the nightmare of children basically suffering as their home becomes a threat. And subtle changes in the Skinamarink universe cause such a deep amount of dread. Like, why is this so scary? There is no rational explanation for that. And younger generations don't only have a rapidly changing and hostile environment, but there is the double and triple and quadruple whammies of loss of ownership and a crumbling culture. Right now, we are living through this like renters economy where most things are rented and not owned. Even like renting the option to heat the seat of your car and not really owning any movies that you watch. And then on top of that, homeownership is a pipe dream for anyone close to my age who doesn't have somebody to help them. Today's 20 to 25 year olds have 1/10 of the purchasing power that the boomers had. So when the middle class basically starts collapsing and all the ladders have been pulled up and we're living through like a very scary economy, the liminal space horror of things not being right and things feeling wrong is a symbolic representation of the shaking of the foundation that we are all feeling. And like, even adding on to that, the upcoming generations like having no buying power has made it so we don't even have like an aesthetic as a generation to add to that feeling of stability and belonging. If you walk outside, there is no immediate like, oh, I'm in 2026. When you walked outside in the 80s or the 70s or the 50s, you knew what generation you were in. But because of all of this institution, it literally feels like the fabric of time could rip. We have no ability to create culture because our jeans fell apart in the wash because they're from Temu. There is no such thing as like feeling stable and feeling at home in this type of universe. Now, Vivarium is like very debated on, is it a good movie or not? Because a lot of people like it and a lot of people hate it. Personally, I think it's a fantastically made film, but the couple in Vivarium literally proves this symbolic point. The gardener and the teacher symbolically see this stable, middle class home ownership, raising kids existence as so foreign to them that in this movie it is literally an alien, and it is an uncanny, endless liminal space that they can never escape. So that's like a film that represents kind of what I'm talking about in a way. Another way that the fabric of society and time is ripping for my generation especially is the illusion of grandeur has basically been shattered through nepotism and corruption. The idea of meritocracy has basically been destroyed. And then the idea that if you do make it to the top of the chain, that you're going to be in company with people that are doing what they were doing. How is that not reality shattering for most people? The glitter of success has been gone and replaced with a desperation for stability. If we go to scary movies to represent what we are scared of, how is liminal horror not exactly a mirror image of that? And just like the time-ripping incoherence essentially makes the very like strong-willed characters' personalities disappear, like because of their desperation, you can kind of see like when you have no stability, when you cannot even depend on time itself or the idea of death itself, you literally start to fracture. And liminal horror is so dependent on instability. And I think that is so much more horrifying than being chased by someone or being scared of being infected. Liminal horror is so dependent on the fear and the dread that comes with instability. Like, will this door lead to an exit? But there also is this dread that comes with the idea of being forgotten. We are facing literally climate change in a way that nobody before us has ever had to even think about. And for most of human history, the idea that you would be remembered is kind of what kept society running. You can literally look at anyone or any kind of piece of media from throughout our very long history of media, and you can see that the greatest achievement is not being super powerful, but it's actually being immortalized. But now there is a deep fear that we will be some of the last generations of humans, or we will be forgotten. Birth rates are hitting historic lows because of how little people believe in our future, and the people in power are doing basically nothing to stop it. So why is being forgotten such a bad thing? Well, being forgotten creates a lot of these liminal space feelings. Decay, dust, and abandonment are quite literally symbols of this idea and this fear, and you can see that in already uncanny media. These horror scenes present our worst fears to us on a platter, that the world isn't home, the world has been abandoned, things are not right. Now, along with all of that, on top of everything else, we are experiencing like the rise in technology in a way that has caused mass surveillance and data extraction rather than user needs. And AI has become a threat instead of a tool. So when you see this like massive degradation of personal privacy, we are constantly faced with this disassociation kind of mirror image of ourselves that we are. The self that is collected and surveilled with data or surveillance, and then the self that we willingly put on the internet like I'm doing right now. So when you think of like a media analysis to this idea of disassociation and mimicry, you literally are directed to uncanny horror or loss of autonomy horror. And the uncanny valley, specifically when you look at like robots or a weird piece of tech, plays on the subconscious fears of annihilation, replacement, and reduction. And in Skinamarink, for example, and in a lot of these horror media, the all-knowing entity is not a monster or something that you can destroy. It is an omnipresent force that cannot be bargained with. And that is literally how the internet feels and technology feels right now for a lot of people, if you're paying attention to it. So the more like a robot looks like a human being but isn't quite, or an AI deepfake looks like someone you know but it isn't fully right, the more it represents a deep challenge to our identities as human beings. So uncanny horror is the manifestation of our fear of technology directly. And I'm honestly surprised there hasn't been more media about that specifically because of how clearly it mirrors that fear. And my prediction is the Backrooms, which is coming out very soon. The teaser just came out. I think that movie will not be like a spot in the dark lone example of uncanny liminal space horror. I think it will signal a shift in where horror goes, and if it truly is representative of the people and it is a mirror, as it has always been, I think our generation's horror aesthetic will be the void. But it isn't all bad because we are all in it together, so it isn't totally bad. So that's just some of my predictions on where horror is going to go. It kind of is a heavy topic because we're talking about our fears as a generation, and how else am I going to talk about that? But thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a really good night or a good day, but let's be honest, you're not watching this in the day. At least I hope you're watching this in the day because I can guarantee you I'm getting scared by the clips that I put in this video. Okay, peace.